8th anniversary of Swann. Obviously, this is a very important day. It was a very important day 50 years ago. It's a very important day now, and I'm delighted to be here to introduce what's going to be a really marvelous panel, I think, regarding Swann and its legacy. We have key players and chroniclers of this significant decision and action that made such a difference for our city, Charlotte, and for the nation. Just to say a moment, I mean, this is not how I expected it to start, just because of the historic nature of the decision that came down in Minnesota. But I think that there is a link, and I think that there is a meaning to there being these two important events on this same day, May 20th, exactly 50 years apart. And I think what we can learn in part is that the judicial system, the legal system, matters so much in our country. I mean, that indicates important things happen and they have real significance and they have lasting significance. But I think the other important aspect of that is that legal decisions are only a beginning. They are a tool, they are a symbol. But whether the ideas that they embody, as particularly the drive toward justice and equality that they embody, only become reality when people take what was said, what was ruled, and make it happen in their own communities, in their own cities, in their own lives. And I think we'll see with Swann that this was a case where there were a lot of legal actions. Finally, a community decided to step up and do something. But then when community support ebbed, there was backsliding. That's the only thing I can put. It requires consistent effort from people on the ground. Justice does not. It may roll down like water, but in real life, you have to divert that water. You have to work with that. It doesn't just happen spontaneously. And I think all of the people here tonight can speak to this. This is the same thing with the Minnesota decision. It's wonderful. I mean, I'm elated that the verdict was for guilty for holding a man in the system responsible for what happened, but for that to have genuine meaning and significance in going forward for all the other people who deal with the police or for communities, and to make real change, we're all going to have to pitch in and really make it happen. And so I hope that our discussion tonight can be an example of what can happen and also what has to happen. And I think what's going on, to be honest, we're having a little technical difficulty, as always happens. We're having trouble getting James Ferguson on the call. So I think, why don't we go ahead and I will introduce the gentleman that you see on the screen in front of you. My name is Pamela Grundy, and I am a historian here in Charlotte. I've been a historian for quite a while here in Charlotte. I've written some books, particularly a history of West Charlotte High School. So, and segregation, desegregation, resegregation, it's been a important piece of my life. I also had a son who went through CMS from kindergarten through 12th grade. So I've had experience of the school system and the many challenges it has faced in terms of providing a marvelous education for all students. We have here Arthur Griffin, who has been one of the key people In all of this through the years, Arthur grew up in Charlotte. He attended segregated schools during the era of segregation, graduating from Second Ward High School. And then he went to the Army. He was in Vietnam. And then when he came back, he became a real advocate for education, for educational justice, and had a long career, which culminated in his becoming the first African American chairman of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board, in which he dealt with many of the issues, particularly the dealing with the dropping support for busing and resegregation. I mean, from a position of some power and a great deal of insight. So it's wonderful to have Arthur, who's got so much experience and who's also quite involved today in advocating for a great education for all children. So that's Arthur. We've got down here Frye Gaillard. He is a highly respected and highly awarded historian who has written many different kinds of books. His latest, which is called Hard Rain, it's an account of the 1960s, just won a couple of real nice awards. And he has also written, he came to Charlotte right after the Supreme Court decision to work for the Charlotte Observer, and wrote for many, many years on race and schools and issues such like that, work that culminated in the first real history of the Swann decision, which was called A Dream Long Deferred, which told the story of the Swann decision moving through to when the plan that really created desegregation in 1974. A marvelous book, well worth reading. And he sent children to CMS, as did Arthur, and his wife, or the deceased, unfortunately, but his wife was also a teacher to principal in CMS. So he has, again, a wide experience of what we're going to do. When we get James Ferguson on, he will also be, he'll have so much to say. Fergie he grew up in Asheville. He attended segregated schools in Asheville. He and his wife, Barbara, were key members of the civil rights movement in Asheville. Asheville didn't have a college. In many communities, when you had the sit-ins and such, it was college students. There was no college for African Americans in Asheville, so it was the high school students. And so they sat in and did all sorts of things. He then became a lawyer, and he came to Charlotte to be one of the first partners with Julius Chambers, who is the extraordinary litigator who filed the Swann case, who took it to Judge McMillan, and who then carried it to the Supreme Court and got that Supreme Court decision. So Attorney Ferguson can tell us about that. He, again, also sent his children to CMS, and so he can speak to that as a parent as well. And then he followed the case through the Capacchione decision, which then ended busing in Charlotte, and he has continued to fight both legally and politically for the kind of school system that will value and educate all children. So that's where we are. And again, we're waiting for, I'll tell you just a little bit then about how this is going to work. I'm divided this into 4 different segments. It's hard to cover this much history in just a fairly small amount of time. And so I'm going to introduce each segment with a brief historical to set the stage, and we're going to have a couple of images up so you can see, and then I'm going to turn to those fellows who have direct experience of that particular period. So you'll see a moving in and out of people as we reach the periods of time that they have the most to say about. So maybe we could go ahead then and just get started with the slides. And so the first section is going to be on segregation. The Swann decision was a major transformation in terms of moving from what had been a legally segregated system to a system that remained largely segregated because predominantly white school boards wanted it that way, to a system where the courts demanded that genuine desegregation take place. So what we want to start with is just to set the stage for Jim Crow segregation and the why this lawsuit is filed. And the thing I think first to say, in many parts of North Carolina, that segregation was designed to be separate and unequal. Funding, they funded white school, the powers that be, all of whom were white, deliberately funded white schools better than black schools, because part of the Jim Crow system was the effort to weave this idea of white supremacy, that whites were superior and blacks were inferior, into every aspect of daily life. So in nowhere was under the idea of white supremacy, Jim Crow, could blacks be seen to have anything as nice as whites. I mean, you see this in the water fountains, you see this in the bathrooms, and you see this in the schools where they deliberately spend less money on black schools. But what happens in many of these schools is you have these extraordinary teachers and administrators, and we've got some pictures of some West Charlotte folks up there, up in the upper right. Thomas Martin, who was the wonderful coach and teacher at West Charlotte for many, many years. Down in the left, that's Pop Miller, who taught shop and then was a assistant principal, and then actually became a principal of East Mecklenburg High School during desegregation. Tremendously successful. Lilestein, I can't remember her last name now, but she's down there in the right. She taught anatomy and cosmetology. Marvelous teacher. And I think that's Samuel. Sorry, I can't remember all the names right now. But anyway, but they were highly educated. They had wide experience of the world, and they poured their efforts into their students, who they knew well, who they lived down the street from, and they made this segregated system of education, the African American schools, far better than they were supposed to be. They really helped to transcend, in many ways, the idea that they were supposed to be second class. They did not believe it. They did everything. Then you get Brown, and in 1954, the Brown decision comes down, and the Supreme Court essentially says we cannot have this separate and unequal. Separate cannot be equal. You have to integrate. Across the South, there was tremendous opposition to that, including in Charlotte. And when the first students, it takes 3 years from 1954 to 1957 to get any black student into a white school. When the first handful of white students go, or black students, and particularly Dorothy Counts, who was supposed to go to West Charlotte but ends up going to Harding High School, arrives on the first day. She is met by an angry mob, and you can see this in the picture here. This went all over the world. I mean, these pictures were seen around the world of these white boys generally harassing her. She ends up staying only a few days. And essentially what happens, the school board drags its feet. They institute a set of policies, and maybe 1 or 2 black students get to go to white school every year. A lot of kids apply, but they're not accepted. So there is essentially no actual desegregation that follows Brown. We can get the next slide. And so what you get is then a second lawsuit, which is filed by Julius Chambers. This is Julius Chambers here, who has come to Charlotte after, anyway, he's just utterly brilliant. He is from Mount Gilead, just outside of Charlotte, and he attended North Carolina Central University, went to law school. He was at UNC, first black editor of the UNC Law Journal. I mean, he was, again, utterly brilliant. The NAACP then sends him to Charlotte specifically to file civil rights cases. And one of the cases he decides to file is the Swann desegregation case, which basically says desegregation has not happened and it must happen. So this is the first period. So we're going to get right up to Swann. And so I just like Arthur. Could you speak for a little bit just about what it was like to go to these segregated schools?
Certainly, and thank you so much. I want to first of all say how honored I am to be on a panel with such distinguished folk like Pam, who's a historian and has been able to tell our story, with Frye Gaillard, who was a superb reporter and historian also, who even for both of these historians and authors, you managed to put my name in both of your books. So I'm real appreciative to that fact. And also with James Ferguson, who, of course, was the partner of Julius Chambers. The Swann case was first filed in 1965. So let me take you back to Brown, 1954. That's my first grade year. I was 6 years old, and I was assigned to Alexander Street Elementary School. At the time, that was the only elementary school that I could attend that was in my neighborhood, which was First Ward. And to give you a little history about that experience, there were so many African-American students that lived in First Ward. We actually had to attend in shifts. There was a morning shift and an afternoon shift. That just tells you about the allocation of educational resources at that point. And the school was located on Alexander Street and 12th. And can you imagine a young first grader or second grader going to school and going out on the playground, and 20 yards away from the playground across the creek was this wonderful neighborhood called Piedmont Courts. It was all white. And those students who lived just 20 yards away were not allowed to go to Alexander Street, which was right across the creek. My experiences at Alexander Street are with me even today. As Pam so well articulated about the quality of the teachers, my first grade teacher, Miss Louise Young Harris, when I became chairman of the school board, I reached out to Miss Young Harris, my first grade teacher, and asked her to join me at Providence High School to say a few opening comments to the new teachers who were joining CMS at that time. And this lady, who's in a wheelchair that's 100 years old, was extraordinarily articulate. And she said to those new young teachers, know your content and love your students. Those were the type of teachers that we had at Alexander Street. Some you may know as historians. You probably remember Mildred Baxter Davis.
Oh, absolutely.
She was a teacher at Alexander Street. You may know Bertha Maxwell Roddy, who worked with the Afro Center, was a teacher. And these folks all lived in the same neighborhood with me. So teachers were like gods back then. They provided us not only the kind of education that would help us move forward, but also nurtured us in terms of how to survive in a segregated world. I was born in Good Samaritan Hospital, a black hospital, because my mother was not allowed to go to Charlotte Memorial. So my whole world, was segregated. And as I moved through the education experience, civil rights was happening in the country. And so as First Ward sort of transitioned from black to white, the whites abandoned First Ward Elementary School. And so we were allowed then to go up to First Ward Elementary School as a token of equity or trying to equalize the educational experiences of African Americans. We had to pay a book rental fee. Could you imagine that? For hand-me-down books that had 4 or 5 names in them prior to our utilizing those books. But I really didn't realize the impact of segregated schools until I got to high school, which was Second Ward High School. My experiences up until that point was loving elementary school teachers. It was an all-black experience. I felt I was getting a great education. But once I got to second ward and taking biology and taking chemistry and taking physics, well, the Board of Education provided new lab manuals, but guess what? We didn't have the laboratory equipment in biology, chemistry, and physics, or uh, the consumable supplies necessary to do those particular experiments. So what did Mr. Levi and Greta Moore and the teachers, they moved around the lab. Well, we can't do this exercise because we don't have those resources. Let's skip and do these other exercises. So despite the fact that we did not have the adequate resources of most of the white schools, those teachers improvised and did the very best they could do. Pam, you probably remember this. Ashley Hogwood served with me on the Board of Education for a number of years. He's a white lawyer here. But Ashley would tell the story from the dais that he attended Central High, which was down the street where old Central Piedmont is located now. And Ashley actually tells the story of walking up to Second Ward with old Central High football uniforms and band uniforms to donate to the Second Ward high school students. So we had, from my experience, the absolute best classroom teachers that you could ever imagine. All were well trained. Almost all of them had advanced degrees, but we didn't have the other ingredients that would guarantee us the kind of success that Brown decision and certainly subsequently the Swann decision that was filed in 1965 and then finally in 1969.
Well, I think that's just great. I think exactly. I mean, I think you face this situation where there are wonderful things based on what the people themselves involved do, and then there are these disparities created deliberately by the system to make, again, African Americans. There's a reason you get that secondhand uniform. It's not just about money. It's about who matters and who doesn't. It's a very powerful symbol. And so those things happen. If we could go to the next set of slides, I think this will transition us really well to the Swann decision, which is going to be, again, there's in 1965, they filed the decision, Julius Chambers files this case saying that that Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools has been inadequate in terms of desegregation, and there needs to be more. Actually, if we could back up let's go to Julius. He's at the last slide. So if we go back and then another one, here we got Julius here as a young man who has filed this case. And the point I think is very important for this case is that in some ways, I think there are people that the case is named for the Swann family, for Vera and Dwyer Swann, who were the lead plaintiffs, although there were quite a number of other African Americans who also were on the case. They really did believe in integration. I mean, felt very strongly that their young boy, James, should go to school with a wide variety of children. They had been missionaries in India. They'd in fact come back from India in order to pursue the civil rights struggle. But James had been to an integrated school. They felt it was very important and they wanted an integrated school. But that wasn't the only thing people wanted. I think Julius Chambers was very, very forceful and very serious in his belief that the system would only provide equal resources if every school contained children who mattered to the people who were running the system. He certainly did not believe that Black children needed to sit next to white children to learn. He didn't believe that there wasn't anything magic about that, but he felt like to get the resources you needed, to get the science equipment, like you said, Arthur, to get the up-to-date books that actually taught you what was going on as opposed to what the science was 20 years ago, to do all of that, the only practical way for that to happen was for there to be white children in every school, because then the powers that be, who at that point are pretty much exclusively white, will have, there'll be kids they really care about in every school. There will be parents of those children who have political power who can pressure them to give equal resources to every school. So it's a very clear-eyed political decision that he makes, that the only way to have equality is for every school to be completely integrated. And now let's go ahead, we'll go forward again, Swann, and then the next one. And he makes this argument. Swann eventually comes before Justice James McMillan, who is a federal judge, who is not particularly known for being a radical, person, but he's very thoughtful. And Julius Chambers makes this argument to him. And he argues, there's a couple of things he argues, and I'm sorry that Fergie's not here because he could explain it much more eloquently than I do, but he argues that that equality can only happen with full desegregation, and that in fact it is the sort of situation of 1969, which is a limited amount of desegregation sort of here and there and still tremendous inequalities, is the result of federal policies and state policies regarding where people live. So it wasn't enough just to say, well, we're not going to have a black system and a white system, but because the housing patterns were uneven, which were a result of segregation. If you just said, well, everybody goes to the school closest to them, you still have a whole lot of segregation. And that's what he was arguing to Judge McMillan, because the whole point of Brown was that the state had done something wrong. Segregation was wrong. It was an act of the government, and therefore it was incumbent upon the government to make it right. And so by arguing that the existing situation of still segregated schools was not simply that some people like to live here and some people like to live there, but there were government policies that had created it, that it had to be, it was incumbent upon the government, as I said, to make it right. So Justice McMillan listens to this, and he is persuaded. He agrees with Chambers, and he puts out an order that says, yes, Mecklenburg must be, and the only way to do that, because there's a tremendous amount of segregation, is to bus kids all over town. If you're going to fully integrate the schools, it's going to be a big project. But Millen says if that's what it takes, you're going to have to do it. If we get the next slide, many people are not happy about this. Many people don't wish, particularly white folks, but also some black folks do not wish to desegregate because they're concerned about, what it's like to go to school. Well, there's a variety of concern. I think in general, white people have bought into this white supremacy. They don't believe they should go to school with black people. I think a lot of African Americans are very concerned. They have this nurturing environment in the black schools that Arthur describes so beautifully. And they're concerned that if they send their kids off to other schools with a lot of whites, that they're not going to be looked after. They're not going to get, so there's a certain amount of concern. But then there are also people who really feel like this is the only way to get equality. We have here, this is, the Citizens Committee. This is a large group of whites who rally. There's an organization of white parents who rally to oppose this. And there's several years of turmoil in Charlotte. There's uncertainty until in 1971, when the Supreme Court, it goes to the Supreme Court. And in some ways, people are thinking, well, Judge McMillan made this judgment, but maybe we can do something about it. Maybe we don't really have to do it. Let's see what the Supreme Court says. Once the Supreme Court says, no, Judge McMillan has the right to do this exactly 50 years ago today, then it's clear that something has to be done. And actually, I'm going to stop on this slide. Let's go back to that slide, and we'll come to the next slide later. Can we go back one slide? And Frye, you you get here at just about that time and you're dealing with all that. Can you talk a little bit about what that's like?
Sure. I came to Charlotte in 1972, and it was only a few weeks after I got to town that I was asked by my editors at the Charlotte Observer, where I'd just taken a job, to be one of the people covering the turmoil that still existed in the community as the community struggled to find some way to make peace with this issue. And it seemed to me that as I began to cover this story, that there was from the beginning some good news and some bad news. The good news was that there were literally thousands of people in the community, both Black and white, who wanted to see integration succeed and who cared about the education of all children, regardless of their backgrounds, cared about the education of children other than their own children. This group of people who, it seemed to me, embodied the possibilities inherent in goodwill included principals and teachers and parents, and quite notably also students. But at the same time, there was bad news. There were a lot of parents, as you said, most of them white, who simply wanted no part of this. And who were implacable in their opposition to it. And in this supercharged atmosphere, sometimes things erupted into violence, and sometimes this occurred in the schools, especially the high schools. I remember one of the first stories that I covered, or one of the early stories that I covered, was in March of 1973, when there was racial fighting at Independence High School. There had been racial fighting at the 9 other high schools that were then in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and Independence was the last one to fall victim to this. It had begun, as I recall, as an integrated school. Its principal at the time, Sam Haywood, was committed to integration. There were student leaders like a young African-American named Dexter Feaster, who were committed to making it work at Independence. And then one day, in an amazing piece of irony, there were a couple of Black kids apparently giving a couple of white kids a hard time. In the beginning, it was verbal. And Dexter Feaster, this African-American student leader, played football at Independence and was otherwise a source of peace and reconciliation at the school, stepped in to actually defend his white friends and try to de-escalate the situation. And he was jumped by a group of white kids, and from there it erupted into violence that when I got there as a young reporter was just elementally horrifying to me, to see this much anger erupt among young people in our community, and yet there it was. I remember a few images from that day. I remember people working hard to try to de-escalate the situation, including Sam Haywood, the principal. I remember that there were scattered moments of police brutality, but it was also a time that the police in general, I thought, performed pretty well in being even-handed in trying to break up the fight. And there was one moment in particular that I remembered at the end. There were a group of white kids and African-American kids who were no longer fighting, but they were standing off against each other in a kind of sullen moment. And this white policeman, who I wish I remembered his name, noticed that there was a Frisbee lying on the ground. And sort of spontaneously, and I happened to be right there when this happened, sort of spontaneously, he bent down and picked up a Frisbee and tossed it to one of the African-American kids. And the kid smiled in surprise and tossed the Frisbee back to the white policeman, who then tossed it to a white student. And pretty soon, what had been a riot became a game of Frisbee. And to me, it was sort of symbolic of what was possible if people simply displayed and embodied goodwill in the community. And I thought for a while there was an attempt to do that. Citizens organizations who stepped forward, and some really quite wealthy and influential parents like C.D. Spangler or Bob.
Frye, I'm going to ask you to stop that for a minute, because I want to get to that in a minute, because I think that's very important. But there's one piece that I'd like to bring in before that, just to set the context, and then we'll get back to that story because that's so important.
All right.
If I get the next slide on the slide. Can you get me the next slide? Because I want to, next one. Yeah, thank you. I just want to emphasize that there is a lot of anguish, and for African Americans, part of this anguish is related to schools being closed.
Right.
And I think this gets to, and we'll do this and then we'll go, but this gets to, again, it's one thing for Judge McMillan to say every school has got to be desegregated, but how do you do that? And across the South, many of the ways to desegregate schools, essentially a lot of communities closed down their black schools and made all the black kids go to the white schools. And that absolutely happened here in Charlotte. You know, there's this terrible moment in 1969 where the school board shuts down Second Ward High School, Arthur's alma mater, the first black high school in the city, beloved, and it shut down suddenly. The school board has a meeting. Judge McMillan has put this order out. Schools must desegregate. And very shortly after that, the school has a meeting and Second Ward High School is gone. And that pain resonates to today in Charlotte, the fact that that was done. And this picture is actually, there was then a concern that West Charlotte High School would also be closed. The school board wanted to close West Charlotte too. And it basically was saved because Judge McMillan realized that he had made a tremendous mistake when he allowed Second Ward to be closed. And he said, no, it is not possible to close West Charlotte High. This is actually a march of people who care about West Charlotte coming from the school to the school board at a point where they think they're going to lose that school to the second African-American high school. And at that point, the only remaining African-American high school, because Second Ward was closed, York Road was turned into a junior high school. I think Plato Price was also turned into a junior high school. All of the county high schools were basically downgraded to junior high school. So you had only one historically black high school left, which is West Charlotte. And so what I'd like to do now is go to you, Arthur, so that you can tell a little bit about what that was like for the community. And then Frye will come back to you for the plan that actually makes desegregation work. Okay? So Arthur, talk about that.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about that. But in 1965, when the first lawsuit was filed, there was some slight movement towards trying to provide resources. And one of the things that was sort of a slap in the face was that from my elementary years, from Alexander Street, from First Ward, from Second Ward, all of those years, black kids walked to school. And passing us on the streets for all of my time in school were white kids on a bus, bypassing the black schools that's closest to their homes to segregate. And when there was an opportunity for transfers, and some of my classmates did transfer in 65 to Myers Park, the school board still refused to allow black children to use the bus to integrate the white schools. So when Jim Polk's daughter decided to go over to Myers Park, they had to provide their own transportation to get there. And so with all of these little indignities that were going on at that time, the final straws occurred because we saw Plato Price, we saw Torrance Lytle, we saw York Road being converted, and we could see that bulldozer coming down 2nd Street, bulldozing Brooklyn. But there was this huge promise. I mean, this was a tremendous promise. There was a bond referendum that passed in '67 that says we're going to renovate 2nd Ward. Sarah Stevenson was my PTA president. She came before the families and said, here's a picture of the new 2nd Ward. Let's have a contest. Let's try to figure out how to rename it. The new high school was going to be called Metropolitan High School. I mean, so the Black community had a sense of hope that there may be some fairness in this new thing called school desegregation or equity or equality or efforts towards equality. But as Pam, you said earlier, overnight, bam, the decision was made to close 2nd Ward. And of course, the last remaining African-American high school in the city, West Charlotte, the thinking was the bulldozers are coming for West Charlotte too. So the African-American community particularly was not embracing this notion of busing at the time because of the fear that all of our schools and our communities would go by the way of 2nd Ward. The entire community of Brooklyn, the school community of 2nd Ward, was wiped away in one vote overnight. After months of planning with families and planning in the community, Frye in the Charlotte News and the Charlotte Observer, there were pictures about the new school and the efforts to reinvigorate 2nd Ward with additional dollars. The decision was like, bam, you're gone. So from the community's perspective, there was not a lot of trust in this new decision in terms of moving forward.
Right, right. But then, of course, we get the and if we can get the next slide, then it starts to become clear. I mean, there's turmoil, there is distrust, and I think it's fair to say Charlotte being a business town, the Sun Belt is beginning. They want outside companies to invest. They want to grow. They want to do all of that. And nobody's going to come to your town if your streets are in turmoil, if the kids are fighting in the schools. I mean, this is a very precarious moment from the perspective of Charlotte's white leaders, that there is this anger, that there are these fights that they get on the news. And so will we get the next slide? Next slide. There's a realization that something is going to have to be done. And Frye, you want to tell about what happened, how essentially Black residents and white residents come together to figure out what to do?
Yes, I think there was finally a realization that began to dawn on at least some of the white people who were involved in this process, that in many ways it was still being accomplished at the expense of Black children and Black families. The closing of Black schools was certainly the most obvious example that you could find. But in addition to that, to achieve desegregated student bodies, all of the inconvenience of busing and the unfamiliarity of going to a new school and all the uncertainties that children would face with that fell most heavily upon Black children. They were bused more than white children, regardless of the backgrounds of where the white children may have lived in Charlotte. But the other thing that began to dawn on some white parents was that even at that, there was a differential in the burdens being borne by wealthier white parents and those of lesser means. And so white parents from working class neighborhoods or lower income white neighborhoods sometimes felt the burden, not as much, but almost as much as some African American families did. And so those families, black and white, began to talk to each other and began to say, we need to try to push for a plan that is more fair to everybody, to black children certainly, but to some white children as well. And there were a few white parents of means who heard that and who said, look, if the litmus test is, are we willing to send our kids to formerly black schools like West Charlotte or Piedmont Junior High School, then let's step up and say yes. And let's bring the resources that we can bring and the influence that we can bring into making those better schools for all children. Couple of things about that. One is it was an affirmation of the strategic legal strategy of Julius Chambers and before him Thurgood Marshall, the assumption that unless you had white people of some means in these schools, they would just never get the resources. But as I've heard Arthur say on occasion, this was, of course, the very definition of systemic racism, that it would take white parents in a school for that school to get equal resources. Resources did improve for some of these schools like West Charlotte because white parents were there. But it wasn't true, even at the best of times, it was not true across the system. And there were schools, even when they became fully integrated, that simply did not get the improvement in resources that they needed. Some did. I remember the principal at First Ward saying that once white kids were going to come to First Ward, which had most recently been majority black, he said all I had to do was pick up the phone and tell the school system I need, and the painters were there, or the plumbers, or whatever. But there were never enough resources, and there was never an equitable distribution, even though I think there were some people who wanted there to be. It was almost like there was a bed and the blanket was too small, and there was pulling and tugging, and it was just never done fairly or equitably. And then our commitment to even trying ended, I think, in the 1990s with Judge Potter's decision.
Right. Well, let's go through. Oh, do you want to speak, Arthur? What do you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, right after the Swann decision in 1971, for about a decade, Charlotte didn't have that explosive growth until the 80s or mid 80s. And during that early part of school desegregation efforts, a lot of the what we call the interior neighborhoods were in transition. For example, Hidden Valley used to be white, it turned black, but it took many years for it to transition. Clanton Park, Smallwood. So a lot of neighborhoods were in transition. To a degree that helped in terms of trying to maintain a degree of equity or in terms of the burden of busing, although it was much more a problem in terms of the burden on the African American community. But I think it sustained pupil assignment long enough, Pam, for the business community to take credit for the fact that we were maintaining desegregated schools, whereas people were throwing bricks at children on school buses in Boston and other places. Charlotte-Mecklenburg looked like we were really going to do what was right and just. But as Charlotte started to grow in the mid 80s, that's when that rubber band started to stretch.
Absolutely. We're going to get to that, Arthur. If you take a minute, let me go. I'm going to run through a couple more slides and we're going to get absolutely to that because that becomes the key. If you could get back up the slide that was there, the previous slide. Okay, this is West Charlotte High School. And I think you're absolutely right. The question becomes, how can this busing be fair? And across the country, there was a tendency by wealthy white people who, again, were in charge and running things to put their own neighborhoods aside. And they would bus the black kids and they would bus the working class white kids, but they didn't bus their own kids. And there was a sense that that was very unfair. And especially in Boston, which just explodes into violence like Charlotte had not seen, part of that is based on the feeling you have these black kids and you have these working class white families in Boston. And being a northern city, all the wealthy people live outside the Boston school district. They live in the suburbs. So their kids aren't getting bused at all, and so there's this real sense of unfairness. And I think what Charlotte manages to do for this period is because some of the leaders like C.D. Spangler, like Jim and Mary Lou Babb, the wealthiest people in Charlotte said, no, we're going to put our kids on the bus. In particular, we're going to put our kids on the bus to West Charlotte High School, the last historically black school, because part of the concern was, well, who's going to have to go to West Charlotte? If we got this black school, which white kids are, it's terrible because West Charlotte was the most marvelous school. But this sense is that who's going to have to go? And it was when the wealthy people said it will be our children who go, that gave people a sense that things were going to be fair. And this photograph is actually, they're very savvy. Sam Haywood, who you mentioned earlier, Frye, becomes the principal at West Charlotte, the first white principal, in part because these well-off white parents want a white principal. They're not sure that they basically want a white principal. And so Sam Haywood gets put there. But they actually invite the students from Boston to come to Charlotte. And the woman on the right of the picture is a West Charlotte student, and the two young African-American women are from Boston. The idea being, come on down to Charlotte and see how desegregation works, which is a tremendous boost for particularly white Charlotteans, but I think also to a degree for blacks, is that we made this work. And those folks up in the North who looked down upon us during the civil rights movement and thought they were so wonderful and so enlightened racially, all of a sudden they're having more problems than we are. And that was kind of an important moment. And so you do get this period where, as you said, Frye and Arthur, things are not perfect, but a lot of good things are happening. There is a little more even distribution of resources. Kids do get to meet different kinds of, to meet each other. If we can get the next slide then, and we'll come to what I call national model. And Charlotte becomes, famous for this. For 25 years, Charlotte has the most desegregated major school system in the nation. And reporters come to talk about it. And it is very good for Charlotte's reputation nationally to have this. There's a picture of West Charlotte. You see a group in many schools, blacks and white kids. They got along really well. They loved, particularly in the 70s. The 70s, I remember one woman told me who went to West Charlotte, she said, you wanted to do something different. This was the era of the streakers. If y'all remember from 1970, that being different, going beyond the past, doing better than the past was something that people really were excited about doing. So you get West Charlotte, you get, next slide. This is Sam Haywood, this principal who Frye discussed was so troubled with what happened in Independence, who becomes the West Charlotte principal. And this is Murdy Rice, who was one of the great West Charlotte teachers. And it's very interesting. Sam Haywood comes, you can see he's quite a lot younger than Ms. Rice. He comes, he's the new principal. The first thing he thinks he should do, because he wants to start over, he's like, well, let's forget about the past and we'll just have all new students here together and we'll begin. So he takes down all the trophies and all the photographs from the segregated West Charlotte, from the black West Charlotte. And he puts them away because he's like, we're going to start new. And Murdy Rice, who's been at West Charlotte since the 40s, comes to him. And she says, Mr. Haywood, you cannot do this. this is wrong. We can't start this way. We have to acknowledge our history. In order to move forward, you put those pictures back up. And to his credit, he listened to her, kind of like James McMillan listening, when he was willing to listen and to learn. And so he put the pictures back up and he put the trophies back in the cases, and he listened to these fabulous, experienced Black teachers who were much more experienced than he was, who knew more, and therefore they were able to help him craft a West Charlotte that drew on the value of the past and moved it into forward for white children. And that just becomes very important. The next slide. And one of the things that does happen in the community is, as people get to know each other, they're proud of the school desegregation, African Americans start to have more influence in politics. And you see here, this is Harvey Gantt, who becomes the mayor of Charlotte. He's one of the first Black. Charlotte's a majority white city at this point. I mean, Harvey Gantt does not win because just Black people vote for him. He has moved up. He's been a city councilman. He actually integrated Clemson University back when he was a young student. But so he becomes the mayor and is able to do a lot. It's sort of a symbol. There's this time that there are opportunities opening up. Charlotte takes pride in being a more integrated city. In some ways, a lot of that is good. And I would let y'all talk about your students your children going to these schools and what that's about. But I think as time is moving on, I want to skip over this period and go to the backsliding period, because I think how this unraveled in some ways is more important right now to look at than the fact that a lot of good things happened. If that's all right with y'all.
Yeah,
Okay,
can I just say one thing very quickly?
Absolutely, yeah.
2 of my 3 children went to West Charlotte, graduating in 1994. And it was one of the great formative experiences of their lives. And I just want to say that. They were, by that time, my memory is that West Charlotte was no longer majority white because there was no requirement that it be. They were, but they had friends who were not white. They had friends who were, but they got as good an education as kids could. So as a satisfied consumer, I was incredibly proud of what the school system did for my kids. But as Arthur was alluding to, and this becomes part of the next chapter, it became harder and harder as the city grew to figure out what to do about that growth and how to make it remain equitable for all the kids. He can speak to that in much more detail, and I stopped covering the case at about this point and was just a parent.
Well, I want to say,
and let's actually, go ahead, Arthur. Your kids went to a historically white high school.
Both of my son and my daughter graduated in 1996 and 97, respectively, from Charlotte-Mecklenburg High School. And to this day, they still have white friends that they communicate with. And one experience just blew my mind, and that is at a daycare center, she met one of her classmates, white classmates, that was just having a new baby and put him in the same daycare center. So you had a Black South Met grad, a white South Met grad with their children at the same daycare center. So, those were the kinds of hopes and dreams that we all wanted, Black, white, everybody wanted, as we went through Brown and also in Swann. And it's unfortunate that we all didn't embrace equal justice under the law, because I used to always say, Black people won the lawsuit in Brown, they won the lawsuit in Swann, and white people designed desegregation and it just didn't, that rubber band just didn't last long enough. It popped at a certain point. So I wanted to share that.
So, absolutely. No, I think that's just terrific. So we'll move into, I mean, you'd love to dwell on the good parts, but I think the key being is that they happened and then they didn't last. So let's move to then what happened, why this wonderful experience that y'all had did not just continue. So if we could get the next slide, I'll look at this backsliding. And then the next slide. I mean, what happens? There is then in 1977, a new lawsuit is filed challenging the busing plan and essentially saying that any inequalities that existed in the system in 1997 were no longer the result of 400 years of oppression, but in fact, just sort of people chose what they wanted to do, and there was no need for the government to be involved. And the case does go to a very conservative justice who, in fact, had opposed Swann back in the day. He had actually worked for that group of white parents that we saw earlier. He had become, Ronald Reagan has appointed him to the federal bench, Judge Robert Potter, and he essentially rules that, in fact, busing must end. Not that it can end, that it must end. And the problem with that, essentially, there's going to be going back to neighborhood schools. If we get the next slide, is that, as you had explained so well, Arthur, and alluded to Frye, the schools were profoundly integrated. Housing was not. If you look at this is Mecklenburg County. If you look on the left, that is 1970. And 1970, and then basically the darker it is, the higher the percentage of African Americans. So you can see where, that's not 19, that's the other one. I think if you move, oh, no, that's right, yeah. So you can see there's a big portion mixed essentially up at top. That's a sort of rural areas. There's not that many people. There's a concentration on the west side, and then there's a lot of white people over here, and then there's a more mixed group over there. This is great. I appreciate you moving the slide around. If you go then to this next slide and pull out a little so we can just see the whole county, if you just back it out, and then you see where West Shot, the schools have been integrated. The county is more segregated than it was 20 years before. There's more of a concentration of African Americans. To speak to what you were talking about, Arthur, that these inner city neighborhoods are changing, and neighborhoods that once had been white are becoming more African American. Also is about urban renewal, which when they tear out all the housing for African Americans in the center city, they have to go live somewhere, and they essentially settle in these areas. Piedmont Courts, which you mentioned, of course, which was white when you were growing up and the kids went to the white school, becomes essentially all black. So you get, at the same time, ironically, that government policy is integrating the schools, other forces, including some other government policies, plus the power of development and the fact that white people continue to have a lot more money than black people, means that when they're building all these suburbs out in the South, the people who are moving to them are white because they're the ones who can afford to buy these homes. For a lot of reasons, some of which are historical. So the county, it becomes more and more segregated in many ways, and the distances between, where African Americans live and where whites live become greater, making busing more difficult. And so this is this conundrum that that it's not just about what happens in the schools, it's the rest of the community as well. And let's do the next slide. I can't remember what it is. Okay, now let's go back. Let's go back to this slide. So Arthur, you were on the school board during all of this. Why don't you talk about what that was like?
Well, that was a great experience. Trying to share with my colleagues on the Board of Education that Judge McMillan gave us some phenomenal guidance. He said, as the community grows, where you cite schools should be where the burden is neither on the white community or the African American community. And the theory and concept was that we would build a school somewhere midpoint between those two dynamics of the suburban communities. And as a young person on the Board of Education, people kind of thought that I was hostile to desegregation and kind of wrote about it. But I was talking about fairness. The furthest school we built in 1985 was McAlpine. It was out in the wilderness on Highway 51. And that violated Judge McMillan's order that we shouldn't build schools so far out. There was no development around McAlpine when we purchased that property. And as soon as the word got out that we purchased that property to build McAlpine, 4 developments popped up on the Georgia Planning Commission board. So the Board of Education started following growth. We have to support growth. And we started building schools further and further south of Highway 51 and further away from the African American community. And despite the fact that I got a resolution passed that we wouldn't build any new school in a census tract where there's less than 5% African American population, the board passed a resolution but turned right around and continued to buy property further out in the county. And so we created an untenable situation. I call it like stretching the rubber band. And the rubber band just broke after a period of time because busing was just untenable for putting a 5-year-old African American kid on a school bus at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he arrives at school asleep, and the teachers had to wake him up. That was just unacceptable from my perspective. And we created satellites. So our methods of maintaining desegregation, in my personal opinion, violated Judge McMillan's edicts about how to make sure that the burden of busing was fair and equitable among all students and all citizens of Mecklenburg County.
Right, and of course, I was just going to say part of the problem, of course, being that these bigger features, I mean, if Black folks could buy houses out there in those suburbs, you know, if those developments were integrated, that wouldn't be a problem. You know, what I think y'all were facing is this, you know, there's this tremendous growth and it's tremendously uneven, you know, despite the civil rights movement, you still have this tremendous income gap. But you still have this wealth gap. Go ahead.
You would think affordable housing, something just occurred. Affordable housing's always been discussed as it relates to the climate. How do we make sure that there are more diverse price point housing throughout the county so that we'll have natural diversity, and therefore our schools will be integrated with people from the community. So, you know, the affordable housing is nothing new. I mean, we talked about that in the 70s as well as in the 80s. Right. But we ended up with following the corporate community that had embraced desegregation in the 70s to a corporate community that wanted us to follow growth. In fact, the CEO from IBM came to Charlotte to talk to us. And we ended up building the Governor's Village as a result of that, because IBM brought in an old division out in the university area, and they gave everybody nice laptops. But what did that do? That took away the white population that was fed into West Charlotte.
Right.
And that created a higher ratio of African Americans into West Charlotte. So we made some critical mistakes in the late 80s and early 90s that ended up with a lawsuit in 1997. I don't want to go too fast for you, Pam, but in 1997, a family from California decided that our magnet lottery of all things was unconstitutional. Right. This white family was assigned to McAlpine Elementary School on Highway 51 and wanted their child to go to Old Providence. And because of the lottery, their child could not attend Old Providence. Now, keep in mind, McAlpine Elementary School's test scores were higher The ratio of white kids at McAlpine was higher. Everything that the traditional white parent would, quote, want to have in place was at McAlpine at the home school. This was a parent who wanted to test our school commitment to desegregation. And as a result of that, the Capricorn case became a landmark case because it got us in front of Judge Potter. And I wish Fergie was here because he could tell a lot better than I can.
He tell better than any of us.
But when we went to federal court in front of Judge Potter, we all was standing there to argue and debate the case about our magnet program being constitutional or unconstitutional. And Judge Potter, on his own volition, said, I want to talk about all of desegregation. Mm-hmm. All of the lawyers were dumbfounded. Even the plaintiff's lawyers were dumbfounded because they weren't prepared to talk about all of desegregation. And so we had to go back and then, of course, prepare for trial. And going through that trial, of course, Judge Potter decided that we were, in fact, unitary and we're not under the Swann dictates of having to desegregate our schools. And just so fortunate enough that as a result of having great leadership, we put together a rebuttal and an appeal. And on our first appeal, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with us that we had not yet eliminated all the vestiges of a dual school system, and we need to work a little bit harder. Subsequent to that, we went back to federal court, a full federal court, and the public really doesn't realize this, but we lost it. The question was Charlotte-Mecklenburg unitary or not? We lost that case by one vote. The vote was 6-5. Mm-hmm. And what the court said, we were simply unitary. It didn't say we had to go back to segregated schools. It just said we were unitary. But by that time, the politics was in place for us to go to what's called a family choice plan.
Right.
In that particular plan, as you recall, I voted as chairman of the school board. I voted against that plan because I did not believe that Charlotte would make and maintain a commitment for a desegregated school and support the resources necessary for all kids to get a quality education.
And I think obviously the result from that, Arthur, is you were exactly right about that. We've only got about 15 minutes left. I did want to bring in, if in case there are questions from the audience, that people would like to ask. And I do want to emphasize this movement. I mean, this lawsuit. There were two components. There really was a national move by conservative legal scholars to file these cases. And there had also been this concerted effort, starting with Ronald Reagan, to fill the judiciary with more conservative judges, such as Judge Potter. So what happens is you then get these cases filed, and they've just got just enough votes, as you said, Arthur. I mean, it wasn't unanimous. It wasn't like Swann, which was unanimous. It was close, but you start to get this tipping because starting in 1980, Reagan and his allies had very deliberately started putting conservative justices in, much as Donald Trump did as well, because they felt like the justice system, the judiciary, was a key player in all of this, and they essentially wanted them on their side. I mean, I think that's fair. So that was another bigger issue that was happening at the same time as desegregation, as this opening of both wealth and housing gaps. Do we have any questions? Okay. What ideas do the panelists have regarding how Charlotte can ensure education equity in today's environment? Now, I always beg off this. I'm like, historians tell you what happened. They can't tell you what's supposed to happen. History doesn't do that. So I'm going to let the two of you speak to that issue.
Well, I mean, I'll try to speak to that issue. Pam, it's very much what you said when you first opened up the show tonight. You talked about these lawsuits are like symbols and tools. The Brown case, the Swann case. There's a case today called Leandro that basically talks about equity and providing kids with a quality education. It's called a sound basic education. The courts have spoken. Mm-hmm. It's the citizenry. Are we committed to living up to what the Constitution of North Carolina requires? And that's a sound basic education for all of the students in North Carolina, which means an equitable distribution of resources so kids can get that education. So as you said, Pam, from the beginning, the tools are in place in North Carolina today. The tools are in place, or symbols are in place for us to deliver equitable learning opportunities for students. It's the citizens right now. Our will to exercise what we believe. When you look at the heading at the Supreme Court, like Julius Chambers used to always talk to me. He used to always say, equal justice under the law, Arthur. And with Brown and Swann and Leandro, it's equal justice under the law. So it's how we as citizens decide to use those tools. And today's tool is right there in front of us. You have a constitutional right to a sound basic education. How do we provide youngsters with their constitutional right?
You know, it occurs to me too, as I hear Arthur talk about that I speak as a historian now, there are lessons from the past about what can happen if that citizens, that will among the populace, will among the citizens actually develops. In the 1970s, we did, I think, develop a fairly strong sense of civic commitment to the public schools, and at least embraced as a philosophical concept that the education of every child mattered, and that we needed to commit ourselves to equitable education for all children. And as I said, and as Arthur has said and others, we never got there, but we made some progress in that direction. And so the power of that citizens' commitment, combined with those tools that the law provides, still mean that we can take a crack at this. Or I don't live in Charlotte anymore, so I guess I shouldn't say we, but it's an old habit. I was there for 30 years. So.
Yeah. Right. No, that's
you're still welcome here, Frye.
Yeah, we can. You're honorary charlatan. Are there other questions? How can we follow you? I mean, follow the V Museum. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, if that's what you mean by following. And I have websites and such. And I believe you want to stay tuned with the Levine Museum, because I believe they're going to do a couple more programs on this coming up, because it's just, there's so much to talk about. It's impossible to do it in an hour and a half. And so I think that will be a great way to do this. Frye continues to write marvelous books, to really lead the way as a committed historian. How do we follow you, Arthur? How do we? You're active as you could be right now. You're really working hard.
I'm also retired, so I try not to be followed. Maybe I should write a book or something. Huh?
Well, there we go. Write a book. You've got a lot to say. I mean, we've just got to write a book.
The way, Pam, you set this up in terms of equal justice under the law, because Brown and Swann and now Leandro gives us every opportunity. And so, it's a challenge to us as individual citizens. what's your legacy going to be? The
Mhm.
tools are here.
Absolutely.
The symbols are here. What are you going to do with it? Because the law is
Right.
clear in North Carolina. It's a constitutional right to a sound
Right.
basic education. And we know who's not getting a sound basic education.
Right.
So what are we going to do about that?
Well, and I think part of it too, I mean, it does get, again, getting back to this issue of white supremacy, uh, the fact that many people are not urgently trying to figure out what to do. I think there is a tendency to say, well, these kids, well, they're poor. Oh, well, they're not, they're kids of color. You can't expect them to do, that it can't be all that unequal. They're just not up to snuff. There's not a realization of the level of inequality of opportunity that really needs to be transformed. And I'll just speak very briefly about my own experience. When I sent my son to kindergarten, I sent him to a neighborhood school that had been neglected. It was high poverty, high minority, one of the lowest performing schools in the entire state of North Carolina. And I sent my son there in kindergarten. He is as privileged as they come, two professors for parents, et cetera. And he was not the smartest child in the class. He was not the hardest working child in the class. There were all of these children who were marvelous, marvelous, ready to learn, but the school had been so overwhelmed by the concentration of poverty that they were not getting those opportunities. And I think that's what we have to look at. Everybody's talking now about it's not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap. If these children in some schools are not doing as well as the children in other schools, it's because they're not getting the same opportunities. And I think we just have to keep hammering away at that so people don't just fall back and say, well, you just can't expect them to be quite the same. I just think that's so important.
Well, I can only say I kind of laugh now because the news media, I mean, as I said to you earlier, I went to segregated schools here in Charlotte. Mm-hmm. And out of that segregated school called Second Ward, there are medical doctors, there are lawyers, there are educators, there are people who are doing phenomenal things. And I laugh now because one of our classmates is able to get people off of death row, get them exonerated after 40 years. His name is James Coleman up at Duke, mm-hmm. Duke University. And now when they do articles about James Coleman, they say he's a native Charlottean. There are a lot of wonderful, successful African Americans that have come out of these segregated schools. Can you imagine the talent that would come out of a school where they had access to the same equitable school supplies and opportunities?
Absolutely.
This is about America. This is about who we are. And Pam, and Frye, I served in Vietnam. And mm-hmm. all the years I went to those segregated schools I just spoke about, Alexander Street, First Ward and Second Ward, the worst of conditions. What did Miss Hemphill and what did Bertha Maxwell and what did Mildred Baxter Davis have us do every morning? We pledge allegiance to the flag. Mm-hmm. And at the very end, we'd always say, with justice for all. Mm-hmm. So I think if we as citizens embrace this notion of justice for all with the tools and symbols we have in place, I'm optimistic that we can do a better job for all of our children.
Phyllis.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the thing I would say to white parents is that as one who sent kids to integrated schools, you don't have to be afraid of it. I mean, there's this myth that somehow your kids are going to lose something if you do that. That's grown stronger in recent years, and it just isn't true. My wife, Nancy, who was a teacher and a principal in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, and as a education professor at the University of South Alabama, was in public schools here in Mobile all the time. There's great stuff happening in public schools. And and great kids in those schools, and just do your part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've got one more question here about how do we make the lessons of the Swann decision better known? And I would say just a couple of things. Again, it's about be proactive. Have your church do a study on schools and desegregation, bring in some people who experienced it, follow the Levine. Again, they're going to be doing things. Let the public library know you'd like to know more. They do wonderful programs. Follow what they do. And if, organizations know that people really want to learn more about this, then they'll respond. I mean, there really is. You just got to get out there and you got to do it. I will say again, I sent my son to this school, Shamrock Gardens Elementary. 96% free and reduced lunch, 94% kids of color. It is the best decision I ever made. It was an extraordinary experience. And as I say, sometimes maybe for a while the art teacher wasn't that great, but I could buy him art lessons. I mean, if I felt like that, I could buy him, I could make up for any kind of challenges they face academically. I couldn't buy him a desegregated education. I couldn't buy him the opportunity to understand how other people live. And I just think that's tremendously important. We are pushing right at the end here. This has been wonderful. I thank both of you. Would each of you like to offer just a few remarks to end with?
Well, I just want to say to my high school, of course, was closed, but I wanted to say what a family we were able to develop with all of the students that went to West Charlotte High School. I feel like I'm a West Charlotte Lion simply because of our relationship over the many years in terms of Second Ward High School versus West Charlotte High School. We were all one family. And if Fergie was here, I'd include him because Fergie also went to a school called Stevens Lee High School
right.
in Asheville. And so from the African-American experience, we tried to stay together and support one another. And even to this day, I continue to say that West Charlotte is still my school.
Frye?
It was my kids' school too, and I considered it a great privilege for them to go there. And I was personally a satisfied consumer of public education in Charlotte, and continue to believe in the importance of public education. And let's do what it takes to make it equitable for all kids. We may not do it perfectly, but we can do it better.
And I will just again say, and we cannot do it standing back and like sending a little money or saying things for it to really work. Everybody's got to roll up their sleeves and pitch in and really be part of it. That's how you make justice happen. And I think we are pushing right at the end here. So thank you, all of you who joined us. This is going to be up, I believe, on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch it again. One way to spread the lessons is to tell people to watch this YouTube. And we just have to keep talking more because our society is what we make it, and how we use the tools that we have around us. So with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.